Good morning. Great to be here with you this morning. It's almost like old home week here. I see a lot of familiar faces, quite a few new ones as well, but quite a few people that I've gotten the opportunity to meet over the years. So thank you for allowing me to come this morning and talk to you about the Missouri budget situation. Okay. We're going to start by looking at some economic data, how we're doing, the key economic data that we look at in the budget world. We'll then talk about the revenue situation a little bit and how it's looking not only currently, but projecting forward into next fiscal year. We'll do a state spending update, and then some of the key points for what's ahead for the current fiscal year, the year we're in, fiscal year 2013, and then the upcoming one in fiscal year 2014. And then we'll talk a little bit more specifically about some education issues. Okay, personal income. This is a key statistic for us in Missouri budget land because we are so dependent upon the individual income tax for our state revenue, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So we follow the growth in Missouri personal income pretty closely. This chart not only gives you the actual data, but it shows you what we're projecting going forward to give you an idea of what we're expecting through calendar year 2013. You, of course, can see that really nasty little dip there. Little is probably not the right word. When we came down in 2008 and 2009 and actually had a decline in wages and salaries of 8% at one point in late 2009. Things started to slowly improve in 2010, and of course we're finally seeing some actual growth in personal income and wages and salaries in 2011. We are projecting that continued growth is going to happen through calendar year 2013. I think, though, one thing we should be aware of, it's going to be fairly slow growth. We're not projecting to get back to your more typical 3 to 4% range. We're still going to be around 2, maybe getting up to 3. But certainly, the good news is we're anticipating growth at the moment. Is going to be somewhat slow, though, compared to historical growth rates. Industrial production. I showed this one mainly just as a counterpoint to the previous one. The thing about industrial production, it's a good indicator of what's going to happen in a few months on the individual income tax side. It is leading going into a downturn and leading coming out of a downturn. And so you can see that when you look at this chart with the decline just slightly ahead of the decline that we just saw in personal income. Unemployment rates, although somewhat mirror the employment statistics, the income statistics that we talked about on the previous chart, two previous ago chart, it's still important to look at the statistic. We are looking at Missouri hovering just below the U.S. unemployment rate going forward into 2013 and through the end of calendar year 2013. The good news is we're projecting unemployment to continue to fall. So we had those peaks at about a 9% unemployment rate. We anticipate that will continue to decline. Again, that decline is going to be fairly slow. So we're expecting that unemployment rate to get down to 7% and hover right around that 7% rate through the end of calendar year 2013. That's good. It's better than 9%. But it's certainly well above the historical standard unemployment rate. So we are not anticipating that unemployment rate getting back down to more normal levels for quite some time. Inflation, we do look at this, it's probably the one little bit of positive news, although it has a little bit of a negative connotation as well. But inflation has stayed low during this time, obviously. Both the CPI and the core CPI, core factors out food and fuel costs, so it is a lot more stable. You'll see the red line is a lot more steady than that blue line, which includes food and fuel prices. So CPI, the inflation rate, hovering below typical rates again, all the way projected out through 2013 to remain at that low rate. That's good. It helps us be able to afford the services that we need. It's bad in that it's an indication that the economy is not going to take off in a wild manner or uptick, because that inflation rate is staying low basically because the economic recovery is going to be fairly slow. We'll look at revenue now. We're going to look at the sources of general revenue, some projections, and then the one-time issue, which I'll explain in just a sec. As I mentioned, individual income tax is the biggest source of revenue for the state of Missouri at 67% of our total general revenue. Sales tax at 25%, corporate at 5%, and some other sources bringing in the other 3%. It's good to have a mixed pool of revenue. You all are aware of this. If you could have multiple sources instead of one, it helps you when there's a hit in a particular area. I would say that we are more dependent upon the individual income tax than most states. We do depend less on sales tax, and we do not have a property tax at the state level, and many states do. So the individual income tax and the decline in jobs during the economic downturn hit us pretty hard. The other thing to point out about this, although I don't have the history on this chart, we are becoming more dependent upon the individual income tax as we move forward. Sales tax now at about 25%, used to be above 30% of our base. Individual income tax was closer to 50% at one time. The corporate tax has become less important, less of a piece of the pie, overall pie, and sales tax, when we took food out of our base, for example, and some of the other sales tax exemptions, we really reduced the reliance on the sales tax and increased the reliance on the individual income tax. This chart, if you look at the total out at the far right, those bars, they will show you where we have been since fiscal year 2008 on our revenue. Fiscal year 2008 was the last year that we had normal revenue. It was not a terrific year, it was a normal year, and that is that dark blue bar at $8.004 billion. That was our net general revenue collections from the sources that we just talked about in fiscal year 2008. The low point, fiscal year 2010, is that green bar in the middle, $6.775 billion. So we lost during those 2 years a big bunch of money, $1.2 billion gone from our collection base. So those were challenging years. We are starting to climb back out of that. The last fiscal year that we just ended at the end of June, revenue collections were the $7.34 billion number that you see. So good that we have managed to grow, start growing our way back out of this. Again, still $700 million shy of where we were back in fiscal year 2008. We are projecting a little bit of growth for the current fiscal year 2013. That is the 7.586 number that you see at the very far right bar. How are we doing? Well, for fiscal year 13, in order to meet the estimate for the budget, we would need growth of about 3.9%. We are seeing some really positive signs in the withholding tax, which is the biggest piece of our individual income tax. So we're continuing to see some positive signs, some growth in that withholding tax. Sales tax collections have been a little bit less reliable. They have been up and down over the last couple of quarters, but we are starting to see a little bit more steady growth in the sales tax numbers. One of the challenges for us in the budget situation is that the budget relies on $35 million more in lottery than was projected by the Lottery Commission. So we have had to do some restrictions because we think that's going to be difficult for them to achieve. The hurdles for getting to these numbers, obviously the continuing housing market flux, housing prices we think have bottomed out in most areas of the country, but not all. And if there's still flux in some of the major markets, it's going to have an impact on all states, including Missouri. The European debt crisis obviously has tentacles across the ocean and over here. We're going to continue to see the impact of that on our economy. And then the federal budget story. We don't know exactly what the federal budget's going to look like when they get back after November and have to do something about the budget situation. We know what happens if they don't do anything. I say we know. We have a general concept of what happens if they don't do anything. We have the across-the-board cuts in the budget, and the taxes go back to their pre-Bush levels. What we don't know is if they come back and actually try to do something different than that, what that different is going to look like, and what impact that might have on state programs, local programs, education funding. This is an issue that we've been dealing with for the last few years. It was good to have extra federal revenue for the states. It was education stabilization money, as well as increased federal funds to help us pay for our Medicaid program. Without that funding, we would have been making much deeper cuts across all of our programs, so it's been good to have that money. It is challenging, though, as that money goes away. We have to get our budget ratcheted back down each year as we go through this. Back in fiscal year 2010, that was the year that we had most of the money. It's that $1.25 billion. So we spent $1.25 billion in extra federal money that year to stabilize funding for education and health care and public safety. The next year we had $1 billion, so that was the stair step down in fiscal year 2011. The year after that, last fiscal year, 12, we had $625 million. So you can see we've been progressively becoming less reliant on those one-time funding sources. We still have about $217 million in one-time funding sources in the budget that started on July 1st. That money will be gone next fiscal year, 2014. That over $200 million that I just mentioned is made up of a couple of things. You may have read where Missouri was part of a national mortgage settlement, and the governor recommended and the legislature agreed with that recommendation to put that $40 million in the budget for higher education. That money will be gone next year. We have federal funds carryover again of $62 million. And then the last kind of item, $115 million in one-time fund balances that the legislature used in the budget this year that will not be available next year. So that's our challenge for 2014, is the fact that all of that will be gone. On the spending side now, just quickly, many of you have seen this before. This is the state general revenue operating budget broken down by major categories. Elementary and secondary education at $2.9 billion or 36%. That does not include gaming or lottery money. Those are constitutionally dedicated funds. They do not go into general revenue. So lottery and gaming, as well as some other sources, are on top of that $2.9 billion. Higher education at 11%. The other big piece, the human services at 30% at $2.37 billion, is a whole host of programs, mainly though health care for seniors, people with disabilities, low-income kids and parents. So those are the major slices of the pie. The percentages have not changed a lot. The pie has been getting somewhat smaller, but the percentages are fairly consistent. Some of the key points about state expenditures over the last few years, there have been a lot of cuts in some areas. Spending on administrative functions at the state level has declined significantly. We've eliminated 10% of our workforce. Our lease space obviously is also down as we have fewer people working for the state. We have reduced the space that are available for those workers. We've sold a lot of state facilities, so we have downsized quite a bit on the administrative side. Some programs have been completely eliminated. Some have been cut significantly. There have been priorities set, though. Both the governor and the General Assembly have said they do not want to take reductions in the foundation formula, public safety, disaster recovery. The final point is the tax credit issue. Tax credits do come off the top of the revenue that we have available for all of our programs. And the governor has suggested, and some members of the legislature have agreed, that we needed to do something about tax credits to try to rein them in a little bit, because while everything else has been stable or declining over the last few years, spending on tax credits has continued to increase. So we don't know if anything's going to happen there. It's certainly something that the legislature could look at when they get back. What's ahead? Okay. We're hopeful that revenue is going to stay on track with forecast. There's a lot of uncertainty out there, not only in the national economy, but as I mentioned, international economic issues, federal budget issues, lots of uncertainties. We're hopeful that we'll be able to hit the budget forecast for general revenue, obviously watching it daily to see what's going on. A legislative issue, will tax credit reform be addressed? We don't know. There's certainly some individuals in the legislature who are very interested in doing that. We do have an issue with what we call mandatory spending items in the budget. Those are things that we have to do per federal law or state law. We do know that there's going to be a need to put some more spending in those areas, and so what revenue we do have available, some of it's going to have to go to those mandatory categories of spending. We do have continuing costs from recovering and rebuilding from multiple disasters. Although the drought situation is not typically referred to as a disaster, it is certainly a state emergency. And we will have some increased spending at the state level to help with the drought situation. We have continuing costs associated with the Joplin tornado, with all of the flooding that occurred. We just have had a lot more spending than typical in recovery from natural disasters. And then, as I mentioned previously, what's going to happen at the federal level? If anybody in the audience knows the answer to that, we all want to talk to you, because there is certainly a lot of, if nothing else, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. What are they going to do with the tax reductions? Basically, all of the tax cuts that happened during the administration of President Bush are set to go away. At the same time, we've got all the across-the-board spending cuts that happen if Congress does not come back and do something different. So that is a major issue for all programs, including education, as well as a lot of other state programs. As I mentioned previously, we will have to deal with the fact that we've got over $200 million. That's not going to be available in 2014, those one-time sources. But we have stair-stepped down, and so we think we're in a good position to deal with that issue. We should see continued improvement in the economy, which should help us on the revenue side. But this is always true. When you start coming out of a really bad economic situation, there's a lot of pent-up demand for increased funding. So if we do have 25 cents to rub together, there's going to be a lot of competition for that 25 cents. Lottery funds have been increasing, but as I mentioned, expectations are high. We don't know if they'll be able to achieve the level that has been set through the budget. Riverboat gaming revenues continue to decline, particularly an issue for the education arena. The economy took a big toll on riverboat gaming revenue. To a certain extent, people still went to the boats. They just didn't spend as much when they were there. And since most of that money from riverboat gaming goes into the formula, that has been challenging. The governor has recommended, and the legislature has agreed over the last few years, to make up for most of that through increased general revenue funding. But we do anticipate, the Gaming Commission anticipates continued issues with the riverboat gaming revenue. Even with the new boat hopefully coming on down in the Boot Heel, that's not going to make up for the loss of revenue, particularly in the Kansas City area. There's apparently a new, which I haven't been to, but for any of you in that area, you could probably attest, there's apparently a new gambling establishment on the other side of the state border that is drawing a lot of people away from the boats in Kansas City, Missouri. So that's the issue with one of the big issues with gaming revenue. But gaming revenues are a small percent of the overall education budget, so although it's important to keep our eyes on that, they are, $300 million roughly each. You've got a $3 billion foundation formula. So although they're important, they are not the biggest bulk of what funds education in the state of Missouri. It is general revenue. So bigger issues then are the general revenue side, those one-time funds going away, growing cost of tax credits, competing demands, and then just the federal budget. And the federal budget situation is not just about what programs are going to be cut. They're also about what programs are going to get less federal money and those costs simply shifted down to the states. And we do anticipate that there's going to be quite a bit of that. And so we'll not only be dealing with cuts in specific funding from the federal government, we will be dealing with the fact that they're just going to cost shift some things down to the state level. So in summary, we are seeing positive signs in the economy. That's the good news. We are, as I mentioned previously, seeing continued improvement in withholding taxes, individual income taxes in general. Sales taxes are finally starting to level off and have steady increases versus what we had been seeing, which were continued ups and downs on sales tax. So that's the good news. There is a lot of uncertainty in international condition. Federal situation is very unclear. We don't have much clarity in the crystal ball yet, not for this year and certainly not for fiscal year 2014. So basically the advice is to stay tuned, not only at the state level, but also at the federal level with what is happening. Thank you for your attention.